More than 150 oil tankers are sitting motionless outside the Strait of Hormuz. AIS signals, the automatic identification system that commercial ships are supposed to keep on, have gone nearly silent in what is normally one of the busiest maritime corridors on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries around 20 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption, is now effectively grinding to a halt. Since the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran began escalating and fears of a Hormuz shutdown intensified, at least 10 ships have been attacked in and around the strait. According to international maritime reporting, 7 sailors have already been killed. But the consequences do not end with damaged ships and lost lives. They are spreading outward rapidly into the global economy. Brent crude has surged above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022. Some of the world's largest marine insurers have suspended war risk coverage for vessels operating in the area. Daily charter rates for very large crude carriers have exploded to record highs, jumping nearly 94% in a single trading session. Qatar Energy, the world's largest LNG producer, has reportedly been forced to suspend part of its operations after infrastructure tied to the export chain came under attack. So the question is no longer just whether the Strait of Hormuz matters. The question is this: why has this 21-mile-wide choke point remained one of Tehran's most powerful strategic weapons for decades? And how did Iran turn geography into leverage, not just once, but repeatedly over nearly half a century? Because Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. For Iran, it is a pressure valve, a bargaining chip, a deterrent, and under the right conditions, a weapon. And to understand why this narrow strip of water still gives Tehran outsized influence over the global economy, you have to go back to where the playbook was first written. 4 decades, 4 lessons. Lesson 1: the tanker war revealed the power of asymmetry. In the final phase of the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, both sides began targeting commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf. What followed became known as the Tanker War. More than 500 ships were damaged over the course of that campaign. Iraq struck Iran's oil infrastructure. Iran responded by harassing neutral shipping and laying naval mines in international sea lanes. But the deeper significance was not just the violence itself, it was the strategy behind it. Iran was not only targeting Iraqi-linked shipping, it was also pressuring the vessels of countries backing Iraq, especially Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The message was blunt: if Iranian oil cannot leave the Gulf, then nobody else's oil should move safely either. That was the first time Tehran used the Strait of Hormuz as an instrument of collective punishment, forcing third-party states to reconsider the cost of aligning against Iran. The crisis escalated so far that the United States launched Operation Earnest Will in 1987, the largest tanker escort mission since World War II. Kuwaiti tankers were reflagged under the American flag in order to receive U.S. naval protection. Then came the turning point. In April 1988, the USS Samuel B. and Robert struck an Iranian mine in international waters. 4 days later, the United States launched Operation Praying Mantis, the largest U.S. naval battle since World War II. In a single day, American forces destroyed 2 Iranian offshore platforms being used as command posts and sank or crippled multiple Iranian naval vessels. Iran lost heavily. But it also learned something critical. It learned that a few relatively cheap naval mines and fast attack craft were enough to force the world's most powerful military into a major, expensive regional deployment. That lesson would shape Iranian strategy for decades. Iran did not need to dominate the sea. It only needed to make intervention costly. And Lesson 2, Hormuz became a diplomatic weapon. When the United States and the European Union tightened sanctions on Iran's nuclear program in 2011 and 2012, Tehran repeatedly threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. One Iranian official famously said, "Shutting the strait would be easier than drinking a glass of water." Iran held naval exercises in and around the choke point. The rhetoric intensified. The warnings were unmistakable, and yet Iran did not actually close the strait. It did not need to, because the threat itself was enough to move markets. Every time Tehran signaled escalation, oil prices jumped. Western governments were reminded that sanctions on Iran did not come without global economic consequences. At that stage, Hormuz was functioning less like a battlefield and more like a negotiating chip. Yet Iran did not need to fire the weapon. It only needed to place it on the table. Lesson 3. Seizing ships became more useful than sinking them. After the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed sanctions, the Gulf entered another cycle of confrontation in 2019. The most famous incident came in July of that year, when Iran seized the British-flagged tanker Stena Impero. Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces rappelled onto the ship from a helicopter while fast boats surrounded it below. The footage was broadcast across Iranian state media and quickly spread worldwide. Iran claimed the tanker had violated maritime law, but the broader context mattered. 2 weeks earlier, British forces had helped detain the Iranian tanker Grace 1 near Gibraltar. The seizure of Stena Impero was widely understood as retaliation, and more than that, as leverage. Iran held the ship and its 23 crew members for weeks, using the incident as a diplomatic pressure tool. This marked an important evolution. In the 1980s, Iran used broad disruption. By 2019, it had shifted to something more precise: selective coercion. Enough pressure to create risk, enough ambiguity to stay below the threshold of full-scale war. Strategists often call this gray zone coercion, and Iran had become very good at it. The multi-layered defense system. Iran has spent decades building a military architecture around the Strait of Hormuz based on one core principle. The weaker side does not need to defeat the stronger side. It only needs to make the stronger side pay too much. That is the logic behind Iran's anti-access and area denial strategy. And in a narrow, crowded waterway like Hormuz, that strategy becomes especially dangerous. Layer 1. Naval mines. According to US defense assessments, Iran has maintained a mine inventory that has at times been estimated in the thousands, from basic contact mines to more advanced systems designed to detect and engage ships passing nearby. Mines can be deployed from fast boats or even disguised civilian vessels, making them difficult to track in real time. And mines are not just dangerous because they sink ships. They are dangerous because they create uncertainty. A single suspected minefield can disrupt entire shipping lanes and force costly sweeping operations before insurers, owners, and captains are willing to trust the water again. Layer 2, fast attack craft and swarm tactics. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has long maintained a large fleet of small, fast attack boats. These vessels are cheap, mobile, and highly effective in cluttered waters. Used alone, they are a nuisance. Used in swarms, coordinated with drones and coastal surveillance, they become something else entirely, a saturation problem. And that creates an asymmetric cost trap. Iran can send low-cost boats and drones. Its adversaries may have to respond with interceptors, helicopters, naval escorts, and layered missile defense systems worth millions of dollars per shot. Layer 3. Coastal anti-ship missiles. Iran has deployed anti-ship missile systems along its coastline and on islands it controls near the strait, including Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb. The military analysts often describe those islands as unsinkable launch platforms. They allow Iran to threaten shipping from fixed positions overlooking one of the tightest and most commercially important maritime corridors in the world. Layer 4. Mini-submarines and electronic warfare. The shallow waters of the Gulf reduce the effectiveness of anti-submarine systems designed for open ocean warfare. Iran has adapted accordingly, investing in smaller submarines that are better suited to those conditions. At the same time, the IRGC has developed electronic warfare capabilities intended to jam navigation, disrupt communications, and inject confusion into already stressed commercial traffic flows. This is what makes Hormuz so difficult to secure. It is not one threat. It is an integrated threat stack. Mines below, a fast craft on the surface, missiles on shore, drones overhead, electronic disruption layered across all of it. That combination is exactly what gives Tehran leverage. Why the threat works, even without a full closure. A military threat only matters if people believe you might actually use it. Iran has spent years reinforcing that belief. Every military exercise, every selective ship seizure, every incident at sea sends the same message. What Iran threatens, Iran is capable of attempting. And that gives Hormuz value far beyond the military domain. Because the strait is not only a military choke point, it is also a diplomatic one. This is the paradox at the heart of the entire issue. The same countries pressuring Iran are often deeply dependent on energy flows that pass through Hormuz. That creates a strategic contradiction. To punish Iran too hard, and Iran can answer by destabilizing the artery the global economy depends on. Hormuz also serves another purpose. It helps Iran divide its opponents. The Gulf Cooperation Council states Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman are U.S. security partners. But they also live under the shadow of Iranian retaliation. Every time tensions rise, those governments face the same dilemma. How far do they align with Washington before they become targets themselves? That is how Hormuz becomes more than a choke point. It becomes a tool for coalition management, or more accurately, coalition disruption. How Iran is using the Hormuz card right now. In the current crisis, Iran appears to be using this playbook more effectively than at any previous point. A report suggests that before the situation reached its most dangerous phase, regional actors moved to maximize exports in advance, a kind of front-loading strategy designed to get as much energy out as possible before the chokehold tightened. That matters because it reveals something important. These disruptions are not always spontaneous. They are often anticipated, prepared for, and politically managed. Then came the attacks on shipping. Then came the insurance shock. And that may be the most important point in the entire story. Because in a maritime crisis like this, insurance can matter as much as missiles. You do not need to physically sink every tanker to shut down trade. You only need to make the voyage too risky for underwriters, ship owners, lenders, and crews to accept. That is how a functional closure happens, not always through total military blockade, but through cascading commercial paralysis. War risk insurers pull coverage, premiums spike, ship owners hesitate, banks reassess exposure, ports become cautious, crews refuse routes, and suddenly, even if the strait is not completely sealed, the result begins to look very similar. Ships stop moving, markets react. The choke point works. That is what makes the current Iranian strategy so effective. It does not necessarily rely on absolute closure. It relies on selective, credible disruption. And that may be more sustainable, at least in the short term. Why the US can hit Iran hard and still not fully solve the problem. American military power in the Gulf remains overwhelming. The United States can strike Iranian naval assets, destroy launch sites, escort shipping, and deploy additional forces to the region. But none of that automatically restores normal commerce. That is the gap many people miss. There is a difference between punishing Iran militarily and making the commercial system feel safe again. Those are not the same thing. Even if the United States degrades Iranian capabilities, insurers may still remain cautious, ship owners may still delay sailings, mines may still need to be cleared, navigation systems may still be disrupted, and even a small residual threat can keep costs elevated and traffic reduced. That is why the true contest in Hormuz is not only about firepower, it is about confidence. And confidence is much harder to restore than military dominance. The alternatives to Hormuz are limited. Some Gulf states do have partial alternatives. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have pipeline infrastructure that can move some crude outside the strait. Iran itself has invested in the Ghor-e-Jask pipeline to reduce part of its own dependence on Hormuz by exporting oil through the Gulf of Oman. But the key word is partial. These alternatives cannot fully replace the massive volume that normally transits the strait. And for LNG, the problem is even harder. There is no easy pipeline substitute for much of the liquefied natural gas moving out of Qatar. So even where bypass options exist, they are limited in scale, uneven in coverage, and far from enough to fully neutralize a major Hormuz disruption. China is the strategic constraint. Iran cannot ignore. This is where the picture becomes more complicated. Iran may be willing to pressure the West, but it cannot afford to alienate China. Beijing remains Iran's most important oil customer, one of its most important economic lifelines, and arguably its most significant geopolitical backstop against total Western isolation. That creates a limit. Iran can threaten Hormuz. It can partially disrupt Hormuz. It can use the strait to punish rivals and reshape the market. But a full, indefinite closure would come at a dangerous cost because it would also hit Chinese interests. And that is why Iran's strategy appears calibrated rather than absolute. Tehran needs the strait to be closed enough to generate pressure, but open enough to avoid losing Beijing. That is not a contradiction. That is the condition that makes the whole strategy possible. What international analysts are concluding. Across major Western media and strategic analysis circles, the one broad conclusion is now taking shape. Iran may be losing in conventional military terms, but it is gaining leverage somewhere else, over the global economic bloodstream. That is the real significance of Hormuz in this war. Iran does not need to win at sea in the traditional sense. It does not need a blue water navy. It does not need to defeat the US Fifth Fleet in open battle. It only needs to maintain enough credible threat that insurers, shipping companies, commodity markets, and corporate risk managers do the rest of the work for it. That is what makes this model so powerful. And that is why it can remain effective even after major Iranian military losses. But is winning at Hormuz the same as winning the war? Not necessarily. And this is where the analysis has to stay balanced. First, and the strategy is costly for Iran too. Before the war, Iran was exporting roughly 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels of oil per day. Any prolonged disruption threatens revenue Tehran badly needs, especially in an economy already under sanctions, already under inflation pressure, and already dealing with currency weakness. Second, Hormuz does not solve Iran's central military problem. Disrupting shipping can impose pain on the other side. It can raise costs. It can spread instability, but it does not stop airstrikes. It does not rebuild destroyed infrastructure, and it does not guarantee strategic victory. Third, escalation can backfire. If instability spreads beyond Hormuz into other choke points, especially Bab el-Mandeb, the diplomatic cost to Iran could rise sharply. At that point, that pressure would not come only from the United States and Europe, but also from energy importers across Asia and Southeast Asia. Iran could begin losing the narrative battle. Instead of being seen primarily as a country under attack, it could increasingly be viewed as a broader threat to global economic security. So yes, Iran is using the Hormuz card more effectively now than at perhaps any time in its modern history. But effectiveness in the short term is not the same as sustainable advantage in the long term. This strategy has limits, and those limits are shaped by two things: how quickly the West adapts, and how much disruption China is willing to tolerate. Why this matters to Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Vietnam is not in the conflict zone, but it is absolutely within the shock radius. A major disruption in Hormuz means higher oil prices, higher shipping costs, and greater external pressure on import-dependent economies. For Vietnam, that matters immediately. Higher energy prices feed directly into transport costs, industrial input costs, and inflation risk. For an export-oriented economy, that creates a double burden: more expensive imports and weaker external demand if global growth slows. There are also currency implications. If energy prices surge and the US dollar strengthens during a broader inflationary shock, countries like Vietnam face pressure through trade settlement, capital flows, and exchange rate management. Wasn't because Vietnam is deeply integrated into global supply chains, from electronics to garments to wood products. A maritime shock thousands of miles away can still travel through logistics, manufacturing, and export pricing. That is the deeper lesson here. A crisis in a 21-mile-wide waterway in the Gulf can still shape production costs, inflation expectations, and economic resilience in Southeast Asia. Which means energy security is no longer a niche issue. It is national strategy. It is supply chain strategy. It is financial stability strategy. And in a world where geography can be weaponized, distance is no guarantee of safety. Closing the Strait of Hormuz is one of the clearest examples in modern geopolitics of how narrow geography can generate enormous strategic power. Iran cannot match the United States militarily in conventional terms, but in Hormuz, it does not have to. Because the true weapon is not just mines, missiles, drones, or fast boats. It is leverage. Leverage over risk. Leverage over shipping. Leverage over insurance. Leverage over market psychology. And that is why this narrow strip of water remains one of the most dangerous energy choke points on Earth. Not because it is always closed, but because the world can never afford to assume that it will stay open.